Okay. All right. Pleasure of the council on this. Ms. Marcus? Yeah.
Mr. Chair, if I could.
Yeah, Don.
Yeah, just, so, Chris, let me understand, so you said one of these charts is going to be clear too, or which 51 and 52, which one are you going to?
I believe the proposal is to use, there's language on...
So you can just use the language on...
Use the language and turn it into a
box?
A box or a sidebar.
Okay.
That would
Yeah.
be, that would be in the, yeah.
Okay, I heard you say that. I was wondering.
All right, with the understanding that item number 3 on clarifying meaning and the staff proposed language change will appear as a box somewhere, page 51, 52, but in the Delta plan. Mr. Johnston moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Second, Mr. Natoli. Okay, starting with Mr. Johnston.
Ray, aye. Marcus, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Totally aye.
Okay, 6-0 on that one. Okay, I know no one's here to talk about reduced reliance, so we can skip that. All right. Ms. Davis, Mr. Ray, Ms. Pearson, Ms. Messer, who's going to start on this?
Mr. Chair, should I raise the issue of should we break for lunch before we start this?
Well, look, the problem is, look, this is a meeting full of political groupies and aficionados, and 85% of them are here to talk about this and would prefer to get their juices flowing on the whole thing. And frankly, I think we ought to push through, hear the testimony on this, then break for lunch. It's going to. I'm sure it's going to take 45 minutes or so, but that would be my recommendation.
I'll just defer to Martha on this. She's certainly the person who spent the most time on it.
All right. Let me start by saying that we've had a lot of discussions with stakeholders, in particular at the last 2 weeks, and I really appreciate their patience and their input. I don't think I've ever received so many drafts of proposed language, and they've all been very thoughtful and very helpful. I would like to, if you'll indulge me, to talk a little bit about context for this policy, because I think it's really important to go back to the law and how this policy fits into, how this direction fits into the Delta Plan. WRP1 is a subsection of this because it relates very specifically to the regulatory authority that the Delta Council has. But the Water Code Section 85021 is the law. And it's language that, as best as I can determine, because I was not part of these discussions, was intensively negotiated during the last few hours before the passage of the Delta Reform Act. And that negotiated language means that it's not entirely clear, and it's been left to the Delta Stewardship Council to make some interpretations of that language and to harmonize it. I'm going to read the language just to be really clear. The policy of the state of California is to reduce reliance on the Delta in meeting California's future water supply needs through a statewide strategy of investing in improved regional supplies, conservation, and water use efficiency. Each region that depends on water from the Delta watershed shall improve its regional self-reliance for water through investment in water use efficiency, water recycling, advanced water technologies, local and regional water supply projects, and improved regional coordination of local and regional water supply efforts. The language is very clear on a lot of the ways of how we can reduce reliance and the types of actions that we should all be taking to improve regional self-reliance. But it doesn't give us a clear definition of what reduced reliance means. And so in trying to think this through and make a recommendation to you, the council, we've gone back to the Delta Reform Act and certainly to a lot of the supporting information from the Delta Vision. And I think one of the overarching themes is as we come to the Delta and the years of conflict over what should happen in the Delta is the recognition, number one, the Delta problem can't be solved in a vacuum. And number two, that all of us have to do our part in the export area, in the Delta, in the upper watershed, to try to work out a better way of managing our water supplies and directly to make improvements for the Delta. So what does it mean to reduce reliance? And you've got the word reduce, and the word reduce, I think, scares a lot of people. Now, I've heard in some of these conversations that really the section is about the exporters, and that it was really intended that the exporters should just flat out use less water from the Delta. And yet you look at the language, and the first sentence says, reduce reliance on the Delta in meeting California's future water supply needs. And if you really wanted to be, I suppose, incredibly literal about it, you can make an argument that that means the exporters, but you can also make an argument that it means the Delta, people itself. And then you hear from people, well, wait a minute, if it's really going to be the Delta, what other options do they have for their water supplies? And we hear a similar argument if you say, well, if it's all of us together, what about the upper watershed? What are they? They're dependent on the water from the Delta watershed too. And so it seems to me that in trying to figure out our way through all of this, that when we talk about the Delta and the Delta needs from the water side of things, we're talking about diversions from the water system, talking about diversions from exports, we're talking about diversions in the Delta, we're talking about diversions from the upper watershed. All of those diversions have an impact on the Delta. And so I think in trying to harmonize this language, one aspect of this is that everybody who is diverting and therefore reliant on water that is part of the Delta system should be doing as much as they can, do their part to be more efficient and diversify their water supplies so there's more flexibility and more resiliency in the system to protect the Delta ecosystem at the same time that we're meeting our real water needs. And it's not just for the current population, it's going into the future. In looking at the words reduced reliance and what that means, some of the places I looked at the urban water management plans that as of 2005 have had language about reducing imports or minimizing imports, I think is the language. And you see in the urban water management plan, so I went through a lot of them. So this is on the urban side. At this point, besides the voluntary agricultural plans, we don't have those plans. They're coming. But when I looked at the urban side of it, how were people expressing how they could minimize their imported water supplies or in a more sophisticated way? They all started talking about how would they reduce their reliance on the Delta. And you did have agencies that talked about an absolute reduction where they said, I'm going to be using less. That was their choice. But the majority of the agencies ended up, water suppliers talk about how they are diversifying their water supplies. And when you count conservation as a source of supply or efficiency as a source of supply, and you count groundwater, and you count recycled water, and you count advanced treatment of water, when you add all of that up, what you see in the water supply plans is the ability to show how the amount that's being used in the Delta is a reduced percentage of the total water supplies that are available to that water supplier. And so in trying to piece together what does it mean to reduce reliance on the Delta, yes, we've got two metrics that we're recommending. One is a metric, and it's what we've discussed together. One is a metric that just says an absolute, it's a net reduction in water use from the Delta. The second, paralleling what I saw in these urban water management plans, is this reduced percentage of the water being used from the Delta watershed as a percentage of the total water supplies. The other place I looked for guidance was the integrated regional water management plans, because there was trailer bill language in 2010, so this is following the 2009 legislation, where for applicants for the integrated regional water management plan funding, what did they have to do to qualify, to be eligible for that funding? And again, there they had a requirement. The language from the trailer bill was to reduce dependence on the Delta. And in those applications, and I went through both the applications, and I paid particular attention to the applications that had been approved by DWR in January for funding. What did I see in terms of how people were dealing with this language? There was an application from the Delta area, there were applications from the upper watershed, there were applications from agricultural areas in the Central Valley, there were applications from urban areas. And they all did a similar thing where they called out what they could do for water efficiency, what they were planning to do for recycled water, what they were planning to do for conjunctive management. And some of the really interesting ones also talked about, how they could shift timing of diversions so that during wet years they might take more water out of the Delta, but it was going into the groundwater and it was coming up as part of their groundwater supplies. So there were ways in which you could see how even under scenarios where, in the absolute sense, they might be using more water from the Delta, the timing made the difference. And you could see it coming up again through this reduced percentage. So that is the basis of which we had the discussion here at the Council 2 months ago, and we recommended for your consideration these two metrics: the net reduction in the amount of water being used from the Delta watershed, and the reduction in the percentage of the Delta water out of your total amount of water being used. I think there's some important clarifications that I just want to make sure I put on the table, and they come out of the conversations in particular in the last week. One of the things we do here is everything is part of the Delta watershed for the people in the Delta and the people in the upper watershed. And I do think it's important to be clearer that what we're focusing in on is the diversions, because I want people to be counting conjunctive management. I want people to be counting all of the other local resources that they can develop. I think that is part of what we mean by improving self-reliance. I think it's important to be clear that efficiency counts as part of that denominator when we're looking at the percentage. And we can see it in West Basin's example of their urban water management plan, where they show very clearly the wedge of water efficiency that's being counted. And I think the other thing, I want to be really clear about this. I think there is an opportunity for absolute net reductions in the amount of water that's being used from the Delta. And there are examples of water agencies, water suppliers that are planning to do that. That's their choice. And that's a legitimate metric, looking into the future, especially knowing how constrained the Delta water supplies are. But I think what this reduced reliance and the way in which it's tied to improved regional self-reliance, what I think that really means ultimately, and what we want to be advocating through the Delta Plan, is this diversification of the portfolio. The water efficiency combined with, where appropriate to the geographic region, what they can develop. And I think the final point is, it's really important that we be clear, and we've talked about putting in the next month examples by geographic region of what it means to be in compliance, because different geographic regions have different water supplies available to them. Oh, and one more point, sorry. I think that there's been a lot of consternation about growth and whether or not, if somebody's growing and they're going to be using more water out of the Delta, does that mean they're not in compliance with reduced reliance? And my answer is no. My answer is, what are you doing about water efficiency and these other water supplies to the extent that you can develop them? Somewhere in here, there are absolute limits. I think we all would recognize that. And so the issue here is not to make people do the impossible. The issue here is to try to really prod people to do more than just to do more, I guess, to really try to do more. So that's the context, and I think it's important because there are recommendations that reference reduced reliance. It's not just WRP1. So we should be clear about what we mean about reduced reliance and kind of the goal and the standards that we're trying to set. And then how does it apply within this WRP1? There I just want to, highlight as we go into this, WRP1 is subject to all of the constraints that we have on our covered actions. It's a geographic constraint. It means that the proposed action has to be happening in the delta or partially in the delta for it to even come into discussion. So it does mean, and I think we tried to say clearly, this does not impact upper watershed. It also has to be all the definitions around a covered action. So we're talking about significant impacts on the co-equal goals. So we're not talking about tiny actions. We're really trying to look at big things that are going to have big consequences on the co-equal goals. And then finally, just as a reminder, the way in which we have structured the policy is to focus on the nexus between a proposed action. So somebody wants something out of the delta, and we're focused on water issues here. And the failure to take appropriate actions to reduce reliance, and that failure causing the need for the action, for the proposed action. And there's actually a third piece, which is, and that proposed action has a significant adverse impact on the environment. So we're trying to create a nexus between, are you being a good actor here, and if there's some reason that you're not, how does that drive the need for the proposed or the covered action, especially given if it has a really adverse impact, a significant adverse impact on the environment. So it's within that judgment call that the council would make as an appellate body of looking at, are people doing what they should be doing and adequately contributing, and is the failure the reason that we're seeing the proposed action coming before us? And if the failure is, then the question legitimately is, why should the proposed action be approved? So that's the way in which the policy has been structured.
Okay.
The changes that are proposed in the policy in this draft, final. Number one, we have proposed to change the labeling of the policy because we wanted to connect both sides of the Water Code Section 85021, reduced reliance and improving regional self-reliance. That's number one. The next change in the first paragraph relates to the conversation that Chris Stevens just had with you about clarifying a proposed action. His recommendations for the change in this text, instead of saying a proposed action, it now reads, water shall not be exported from, transferred through, or used in the delta if, and then you proceed down the rest of the proposed action. And you'll see every place where there was the words proposed action in that paragraph, we've replaced it with this language. Similarly, for the second paragraph, those changes relate to just this clarification of not referring to the proposed action. The next paragraph is really...
This is the intent of this policy.
Yes, the third paragraph.
Excuse me,
Don,
Mr.
I'm
Chair,
sorry.
just a question, Mark, before you leave
Sure.
that. So in the first paragraph, you've said one or more water suppliers that would receive water as a result of the export, transfer, use have failed to reduce their reliance on the delta. So in that references back to what you said, it would be one of two things, either the net and or the percentage of water use as compared to what they use from delta?
That is what we have been recommending as the
So
metric.
that's the point that references reduced reliance is compared to those two.
Right.
That's the measures of reduced
Right.
reliance. Okay.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is how it reads.
Okay. Thank you.
Moving down to the third paragraph, again, based on input from stakeholders, we wanted to be clear about the intent of this policy. So the first sentence is a new sentence. It says the intent of this policy is to ensure that urban and agricultural water suppliers are taking appropriate actions to reduce their reliance on the Delta watershed and improve regional self-reliance. We then go on to say that at a minimum, what does this mean? At a minimum, those actions include compliance with all applicable state laws regarding water conservation, water efficiency, and urban and agricultural water management planning, including requirements for the adoption of the rate structures that promote water efficiency and conservation. That entire sentence is not new, it's just been moved. It was in the original language that you saw. Moving to the next paragraph, this is where we've now been clear about the standards, the dual metrics. For the purposes of this policy and the Delta plan, because again, we're making it clear that we're being consistent throughout the Delta plan, what does reducing reliance on the Delta and adequately contributing to improved regional self-reliance means? It means a significant reduction in the net water use or the percentage of water used from the Delta watershed. And that language is not changed from the preceding version. The next change that you see is a clarification of just how progress in doing all of these things, increasing water efficiency, diversification of local water supplies, and other improvements in water management that contribute to reduce reliance on the Delta and improved regional self-reliance can be achieved through, and now we've picked up the language of 85021, but I've added two clarifications because the stakeholders, I think, are right that even though these clarifications are part of local and regional projects typically, it's good to call them out. It's the stormwater capture and use and conjunctive use projects. Finally, and then I'll be quiet and let you ask questions, the stakeholders had asked the question, what is the baseline for this policy? And so our recommendation is that the baseline for initiating the compliance with the policy is the 2010 urban water management plans that have all been filed by the urban water suppliers, and then agricultural water suppliers, as a result of the 2009 Delta Reform Package, are required to have their first agricultural water management plans completed by the end of this year, 2012. And the final point on this, the reason for using the urban and agricultural water management plans is under state law, these are required to be updated every 5 years. And so it becomes, we didn't want to create a whole new paperwork exercise on how do you track what people are doing. This is the current law, and every 5 years, as these plans are updated, you can re-ask the question, how well are we doing at reducing reliance on the Delta, and include that in, you can pull the information out of the plans, although I think ultimately what we'd really love to see is that the plans include just addressing this point so that they're just all included in the plans, they're updated on a regular basis, everybody's doing it all at the same time, and for the purposes of consideration of this policy, we would turn to those plans as the basis for the certifications. That's the information that people would be able to use or give us as to what they're doing.
Okay, Don.
Yeah, Martha, if I could, just to go back to understand, in some of the earlier discussion, you talked about either upstream and or in Delta use. So how would they be affected by paragraph that starts, for the purpose of this policy, the Delta plan, reducing reliance on the Delta? So how would that, and going back to the net and or percentage of,
So-
and you said you're going to use some examples that we haven't yet seen relative to describing what might be some scenarios, but if you're upstream and you're going to, potentially, you're in the watershed and or you're in Delta.
Let's use the Delta as an example. You've got in your, so first off, let's also be clear, this applies to water suppliers that are already defined in law. Water suppliers are required, whether it's now an agriculture or an urban water supplier, to put together your plan describing both how you've been managing your water supplies, and you break out the water supplies by category. So you talk about what are all the different sources of supply, and then going into the future, how those water supplies are going to be meeting your demands. In the urban water management plans, you're also required to include how you are going to address the 20% reduction in urban water per capita usage by 2020. So that's all built in too. So those plans actually have charts that delineate, looking backwards and looking forwards, how you're developing your water supplies and the different sources of them. So it's very easy to go in and look at, for somebody in the Delta, the primary way in which in the Delta there are less options,
Right.
bluntly. And so the primary way that in the Delta entities, suppliers would be able to comply with the policy is just by showing their water efficiency and showing how, per capita water usage is being reduced, and they can either show that they're using less, or they can show that if they have other sources of supply, they include efficiency and those other supplies in their baseline. In one of the integrated regional water management plans, they were talking about how they were planning to do recycled water. A lot of agencies actually now are adding recycled water to their list. Some of them talked about conjunctive management as well. Again, some areas of the Delta, if you go back on the east side, they have some opportunities for that. Others areas do not. But this is all tied to water suppliers currently prepare these plans. These plans contain information about their projects and how they're going to be more efficient, and the other water supplies that they're developing. And they also address, over the long run, with areas that have growth, how they're planning to meet those water supplies.
Don, then a follow-up to your question. You said they could comply by using less Delta water, this in Delta user, or and then I heard you say, if they have other sources. If they don't have other sources, how do they comply?
Simply by being more efficient, just by the efficiency
So point out the
component.
language that does that.
What part of the language, just so I understand your question? So we're saying that it means a significant reduction in net water use or in the percentage of water used from the Delta watershed.
So I'll explain. I think I understand the
Okay.
question. If you do 10% conservation, that 10%, take an overly simplified example, you use 100 acre feet a year, an agency does, and they do some efficiency improvements. I don't know what they do. They line canals, whatever they do, and they reduce water use by 10%, 10 acre feet per year. The way we're talking about counting water use, their future water supply is, and let's say they grow some, so they need more water. Their proportional use of water, though, is decreased by that 10 acre feet, which counts as whatever, say they grow and they need to use 180 acre feet per year. They're now have 90% or 95% coming from the Delta and 5 or 10% from conservation. So they've reduced their use. And I think that is something that is not clearly understood. If you didn't understand it, then clearly that's something that is a weakness in the policy, because the intent is you can do efficiency
If Don
improvements in the
understands
percentages.
it, I'm okay, but I didn't understand.
Well, no, I didn't. I mean, the question, and the other thing is, what if they put it back into the system? Going back to the Delta, is that if you don't have other, there may be some groundwater available potentially, but it may be very limited. So if you put it back into the system, there's a lot of the delta water, I mean, they're putting it right back into the system, not that they aren't doing it in other areas, either to other beneficial uses or it just goes back into the system. It just, back
Right.
into the river system. And north of the delta in the watershed as well. I mean, you capture it, recapture it, reuse it, recapture it, may or may not be treated, but, maybe runoff that's, meets other standards is acceptable to put back into the river system, so.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah, right. So, but how do you calculate? So do they get credit in their plans for that? I mean, if it's released, that's what I'm trying to track here. I mean, if you have to have net reduction either in what you take from the delta or use from the delta, and if your sole source is that you're in the watershed and that's it, you don't have groundwater available to you, they don't know how many circumstances there are, how do you continue to meet that long term? This plan's going to be around for 100 years. Not that it can't be changed, but so how is it that...
I think the way that you would do it is, again, in that particular instance, you're really looking at the water efficiency metric, and it's either on the urban side, you're looking at the per capita reduction, and let's use the growth example. If you're looking at an area that's growing, and they're going to go from 1,000 people to 2,000 people, and they're going to be using under their normal, right now, their per capita usage. Let's say they're right now using 10,000 and they plan to go to 20,000. And all of that water would be coming out of the delta under that circumstance. Now they're going to be more efficient. So instead of they're going to go to the 2,000 people, but instead of using 20,000, maybe they're using 15,000.
They're still using more, though.
They're still using
So
more.
that's okay.
That's okay.
But it's still okay within
That's
the policy
okay,
framework.
and that's what somebody said to me the other day. He said, it was very sweet. He was complimentary, and he said, you've put a lot of effort into this and trying to make this work. He said, it's incredibly wonky, and that it's hard to understand. And I think the part of it that's hard to understand is why, if you're in a situation, well, first off, being really clear, this is not about forcing people not to use less delta water either in the upper water. No, let me finish. It's not about using it in that
double negative.
I know. I'm going to get tongue-tied here too. It's trying to push the agenda of, at a minimum, being more efficient, and at the maximum, diversifying your sources of supply, which, and this is part of the conversation, Councilman Tolley, that we did have before a couple months ago, recognizing that there's probably a third piece of this, which goes to the timing and the value of changes in when water is being taken, which is not yet captured in this metric right now. But going back to my main point, as we grow into the future, we have a choice about what types of water that we use, and in one sense, and in areas that are completely dependent on the delta, we have a choice about how efficient we are in using that water. What I've tried with this metric, maybe I've been unsuccessful, but what I've tried, in probably a terribly wonky way, is to capture both. To capture the value of when we can use less, that's a good thing, and that's the per capita reduction. You can also, in the agricultural setting, it's being more efficient on some of the things we've talked about. There's some great examples out there of changes in irrigation practices and things like that. So that's one part of it, and then the other part of it is where we have choices to diversify those water resources, trying to encourage that to happen, because it's another way of meeting future needs without being completely dependent on taking more water out of this conflicted system.
I'm not contesting the goal, just trying to understand what the bright line here is. Talking about the in-delta, just that one. Okay, so compliance is is a significant reduction in net water use or in the percentage of water used from the Delta watershed. So, Joe, you said that you could meet the test if you achieve an efficiency in the use of the water, even if over time you're using more water from your sole source, which is the Delta.
Yes,
Is that right?
that's correct.
Okay. And is that sentence or that portion of the sentence sufficient to provide the clarity that that meets the test?
I think we may need to clarify it further. That's something that we've had discussions about, that this, it's clear to me, but as people have told me repeatedly, Joe, when you're gone in just 3 months, oh, what about the next guy? And so one of the things we want to do is actually make sure, and it's actually Felicia's point, is take away the worst fears of people. And so that's one of the things that I think it may be useful to do.
Mr. Grindstaff, wasn't it your hope that when you and Mr. Elijah were in room negotiating this legislation, you would have answered all these questions so we wouldn't have to go through
We
this?
didn't work on this particular
Okay.
language. I will point out this has been controversial
and then
from the beginning.
The question is applies to, I mean, it's pretty obvious if you're sitting in the middle of the Delta that that's your situation. But would it also apply potentially to exporters or to, upstream watershed users?
Upstream is not a covered action, but the policy principle applies in terms of the recommendation later on, where we recommend everybody do it. Yes, it would apply upstream, and it would apply for exporters in this policy. I'll use an example if you want.
Because what follows progress are methods, I think,
Yes.
ways of doing something.
Yeah.
But the standard is, if you're covered action, you have to be more efficient if you want to use Delta water than what you are today.
That's right. Or less of it.
Or less of it, right.
Or less.
It can be less, but pretty often it's going to be the other test, right?
It
so
is.
You have to be more efficient.
Yeah.
How much more efficient, we're not saying, I take it.
We're not saying, and I think one of the problems that you've kind of addressed earlier is that we don't have as much really good information as we'd like to have. And one of the reasons why we have water suppliers and tie it to urban water management plans is because it's the one source of information that is currently being used that we could actually tie this to, that every urban and ag, a large urban and ag agency must comply with the law on that. And so it's the one source of information that we can tie compliance to.
And the one clarification I wanted to offer, Mr. Johnson, just you said if you're a covered action, you must do this. But what the policy says is this policy applies if the reason you have to come and get more water is because you failed to carry out these actions. If the reason you need to come and get some water isn't tied to that failure, then this particular provisions wouldn't apply.
Yeah, that's what's kind of convoluted.
Yeah. It's partly, there may be other reasons you need to come and get
Ms.
water
Marcus
other
for a
than
question.
that.
Well, yeah, I mean, we talked about this last time, and I do think there's a way in construction of those two sentences in that paragraph, going back to the original conversation, to make clear that when you say a significant reduction in net water use, or when you say a significant reduction in the percentage of water used from the Delta, this next sentence is trying to define that. But since it's a totally different construction, it probably felt like another sentence out there, because it says this is what progress means.
Oh,
But the
okay.
earlier part doesn't say you have to make progress. It does say a significant net reduction, which one could see as a synonym for progress, but you have to make that leap. So there's just got to be a way to link those together. The question that I think we keep making it a little more confusing, and I'm not saying I know a better way through it, is I'd like a little more conversation of this change to water shall not be exported from blah, 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 because the issue of what does covered versus proposed mean was the question I had the last time, because and we didn't actually answer it. Now it's like we're going back and forth about how grand this is. That first line is like all the water,
Right.
but if, and then you have these constrained ifs. One if is the one that actually constrains it the most, that for some reason people aren't finding any comfort from. And then we go back to explaining the policy when in fact we're trying to recommend somewhere that everyone should be doing this. If you look at climate change, if you look at drought, if you look at all those other things, it is clear if you look from an overall statewide effort that everybody's got to figure out how to be more efficient with water. Don't need to wear a hair shirt, don't need to stop growth if you're in the Delta or in the watershed or even south, but we can't keep using this precious natural resource once profligately. We got to get people together to do things. So we need to be saying that, and we've said it in a number of places. It's not repeated in one of the recommendations unless it's further on. And then we have this thing that's a policy, which is a big deal, that might limit whether someone can do something or not. And it's just, we've put all of the language in here, and it's not somewhere else too. You know what I mean? It's sort of like we built this big mousetrap, which actually is only designed, if I'm understanding it right, to stop the big, a particular supplier who's totally dropped the ball and not done any of this stuff and therefore needs to do something extra out of the Delta. That's all we're stopping in this one. I mean, the people who would be stopped by this is a pretty narrow range. I can't think of anyone
Absolutely.
yet, but there might be one.
Absolutely. And I think that's the most important point. So let's start with that.
But let me hold it it's an important point, which is if that's all this does, we've got to be doing something else in another place to recommend that everybody do this anyway.
Right.
Even if it's not a policy, because everybody should do this anyway, and most good water managers are absolutely doing this, if not all of them.
And that goes to how we redrafted the language, which actually conforms to how the style of all the other policies that we have. So the other policies, for instance, say habitat restoration should be done in this way.
Yeah.
Flood control should be done in this way. Development shouldn't be done. And then in the second part of each of those policies, we narrow it and qualify it by this actually has regulatory effect with regard to these kinds of proposed actions. It covers those proposed actions. So the stylistic change actually conforms to the way that we have all the other policies. But your point is absolutely a good point in that we want these kinds of things to happen statewide. Mm-hmm. And from day one, we've recognized that we have limited jurisdiction. We're not a super regulatory agency. Mm-hmm. But with regard to having any chance of achieving the co-equal goals, you, in your wisdom, decided that this was one of the linchpins. Yeah. The legislature told us reduced reliance on the Delta was interconnected with both of those co-equal goals. I mean, to do it, you have to do that, otherwise you're not going to get where you need to go.
Right.
And so keeping that mandate in mind with the fact that we have limited jurisdiction, we tried to craft a way that we could focus in on covered actions, which we all admit is our jurisdiction, but we shouldn't be allowing covered actions to go forth when the beneficiaries of those covered actions with regard to water management, transfers, exports, aren't doing the things that we all recognize should be done statewide, but over which we don't necessarily have direct regulatory authority. So that's kind of the convoluted way that many people have pointed out. And so the guts of this, what you call the mousetrap, I don't consider it a mousetrap necessarily.
Well,
but
I'm not good at metaphors.
Yeah, you're right. It's the first paragraph, and then it's the definition of what the reduction actually is. So with that, I think keeping in mind that we're talking about covered actions, it's not necessarily the covered action of the water supplier either. We're talking about the covered action a state or local agency is going to have to file a certification of consistency. Could be DWR, could be another local agency. It could be the water supplier that's actually receiving the water. But the idea is that within the bounds of the project, the covered action, if there's a water supplier that's going to be receiving the water, receiving the benefit of that covered action, it has to be doing what it should be doing. So
I get that that's the intent.
it's how do we...
It's just, I think we've enveloped the concept in words, but they don't really...
It's not coming clear.
No, because it feels like you've broadened it to affect more people, when in fact the policy only covers covered action. So it just, it's confusing in a way that even if it's parallel construction, the other ones weren't as confusing.
Randy.
So,
This policy is directed at water transfers and the recipient agency of that water transfer. The first paragraph is clear. What's unclear is that the standard by which the proposed transfer that receives a protest and comes before us, what's unclear is what is the criteria that this body will hold that recipient agency to that will either validate or deny the transfer. What it ought to be very clear that they must have a water management plan. They must have identified those water use efficiency and conservation measures as spelled out in the statute, and that they have reviewed those for local application and determine which ones are economically and procedurally feasible. And then thirdly, that they're implementing those. That's the standard that we should be holding the recipient agency to. The goal of reduced reliance and reduced amount or reduced percentage is the goal. It is the goal. But the standard that we're holding them to is what's specified in the statute. And that's the problem with the policy as it's written. It mixes the goal with the standards.
Okay.